Welcome. You're listening to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. My name is Chris Hayton, and this is part 4 and our final episode of the beer distribution segment. In this episode, I meet up with serial beer entrepreneur Rich Coombes from the new business-to-business ordering platform for alcoholic beverages, Kaddy. Having started other beer and cider ventures in the past, including Batlow Cider and Canberra's Capital Brewing, Rich and other co-founder and former Uber Australia head of operations Mike Abbott are streamlining the way suppliers and customers in the alcoholic beverages market interact with their B2B ordering platform, Kaddy. In our chat, we discuss how Kaddy works and how it can help breweries to start dipping their toes into wholesale distribution. We also talk about the self-distribution and traditional distribution models and how the Kaddy platform combines these two, creating an interesting hybrid of doing business in the wholesale distribution space. A very interesting concept, and yet another example of how the rise of the internet economy and the digital tech world is disrupting and redefining industries in regards to the supplier and customer relationship and cutting out unnecessary middlemen. So I'll leave you to our final episode in the segment, Rich Coombes from Kaddy. Welcome, Richard, to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. Thanks for coming on, mate.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, and I guess just to give the audience a bit of an idea how we came to where we are today, been following you guys on LinkedIn and some of the articles that have been on Crafty Pint about, this new sort of, platform that you guys offer to the brewing industry. Probably not just the brewing industry. I guess we'll find out some other sort of customers from different walks of the beverage industry that you also assist. But very interesting platform that you guys have where it can make it easier for brewers and suppliers and customers to sort of gain access on the wholesale side for pubs or other sort of venues, bottle shops, just making it more streamlined. So I'd like to, dive into how that benefits the brewing industry and so forth. But before we get into all that, mate, I know that you've got a pretty interesting career and background in the craft beer space, been very busy with other brewery ventures and now Kaddy. But yeah, if you want to start out by just telling us how you came to be where you are now and maybe some craft beer stories, home brewing stories, etc.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. Thanks for the background. So I've been in the beverages game for the last 10 years. Before that, worked in corporate finance and did that for a few years out of uni, about 5 years. Fell in love, from an early age with good booze, good food, love going out. And I've always been surrounded by people that, also enjoy a drink. So left investment banking, followed a passion project to start a cider company back in sort of 2010. The idea for that was a little bit earlier. My brother and I, our dad lived in London and discovered real cider in London, decided to make our own. So that was my first foray into, the beverages market. And started a small cider company, teamed up with Batlow Apples and started Batlow Cider. Then in 2012, my brother and I, we were running Batlow and we saw an opportunity in the coffee market. So we teamed up with Victoria to start a company called Will & Co., which we built and grew predominantly on the East Coast. And then in 2015, a couple of guys down in Canberra that I became really good mates with had some awesome venues down there. You might know Honky Tonks and Hippo, but we used to supply cider to those venues and I became good mates and they approached us with an idea that they were going to start a little brewery. But when we came together and elaborated on that idea, we thought there was an opportunity to build a bigger brewery with a bigger production capacity and tap room, etc. So that's how Capital Brewing was born, and there was a few of us involved in that. That was a fantastic experience. And then Kaddy came about a couple of years ago. My co-founder Mike, he ran Uber for Australia, New Zealand. He ran operations for Australia, New Zealand, but we go way back. We grew up around the corner from each other. Used to play cricket after school pretty much every day. Yep. Went to uni together, both kicked off in similar corporate careers. But being close to Uber Eats, he saw how messy procurement was and how there was just all these different channels of communication and it was basically a hot mess. And then from the supplier side, I saw an opportunity, to really streamline things as you pointed out, and to make it easier for suppliers to connect with trade customers, but also do business, communicate, and ultimately get paid as well, which is what we've set up with Kaddy.
Yeah, well, that has been a I guess a thing that has come up with some of the breweries and experts I've had on the show so far talk about, the pains that a brewery will have getting payment for turnaround on their kegs, especially from some of these large pubs and clubs. So, but yeah, great sort of lead into how you've come to be where you are. I guess you have to have that craft beer knowledge and a brewery background to sort of design and come up with sort of the concept that you've had here with Kaddy, and also your partner there coming from Uber. Sounds like a match made in heaven, actually, with how it's all sort of morphed together. But any, I guess, want to always hear from guests about their favourite breweries. Maybe, you might be biased towards Capital. They did really, really well in the recent Gabs. All the Canberra breweries are, but any particular breweries that really stand out to you other than maybe Capital beers or beer styles? I always like to sort of get to know a guest's opinion on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think in Australia there's just so many great craft breweries, and to pick one or 10 of my top picks is really tricky. So I usually go offshore.
well, mate, yeah, well, that's a safe bet, I guess. But what about, I guess, one that sort of introduced you to craft? Or, there's been people that come on and said, I remember the first time I had a Cooper's, or the first time, I had a Sierra Nevada when I was traveling around the States or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think those two you've named I've definitely got soft spots for.
Yeah.
My go-to beer when I was sort of in the early 2000s at uni was a Cooper's Sparkling. You'd get it in a Tawley for $5.50.
Yep.
And it was great. Still a great beer. Sierra Nevada Pale, probably one of my favorite beers as well.
Right. So I really did
nail it on the head.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, when I was in the Mentawai surfing with Tom, who was my co-founder at Capital, one of the co-founders, I was actually reading Beyond the Pale on that surf trip, and that was literally the month before we started putting sort of pen to paper and drawing up all the plans for Capital at the time.
All right. Well, so Sierra Nevada. Any particular beer styles that you always tend to go to?
Yeah, I've always loved my IPAs, particularly more West Coast style, drier style. Still a lot going on, but not a lot of sweetness. And I think, for something a bit more sessionable, there's a lot of great session ales these days. Cracked one on Sunday night with the Lord Nelson session ale. It's fantastic. It's a seasonal. Yep. But I think these days there's just a beer for every occasion, which is awesome. So I do like the more interesting kind of barrel aged, Belgians,
okay, yeah.
But also just a nice crisp Pilsner lager.
Yep.
Every beer has its place, and then of course I love hops.
Yeah, no, I'm very much the same. It seems to be a big push towards drinkability and sessionable beers now. I think craft beer has been amazing in the amount of innovative beer styles and flavors that you can get in beers, like blueberry muffin pastry stouts that I've heard have been made before. I never even thought that was possible. But I think then there's also that thing where craft beer can maybe go a little bit too over the top with, let's just make a beer. You know what I mean? I'm very much between those goalposts in terms of making beers sessionable, approachable. But yes, you also need to, create some buzz. So the odd seasonal here and there is obviously what you do with that. But yeah, always good to hear where they've come to sort of like the craft beer space and beer styles. But so basically, this episode is going to form part of our beer distribution segment. And this is obviously a very interesting concept, Kaddy. When I was diving into this sort of project, I thought, well, we've got to talk about beer distribution, but never knew or heard of Kaddy and this idea around how you're streamlining the whole beer distribution for breweries and suppliers. Is there anything like it elsewhere in the world, or is this sort of one of its kind?
Yeah, we haven't come across anything that's very similar to Kaddy. I guess there's other platforms out there in hospitality, particularly that have been launched the last kind of 12, 18 months that are looking at different parts of whether it's beverages or being more customer-centric and focused just on ordering. But in terms of a beverages-focused B2B platform, Kaddy, with all the supply tools that we've built as well, Kaddy's quite unique in that context. But as always, you expect that there may be others that might appear and down the track as we grow and we build our reputation. But I think hospitality tech as a theme or as an industry has drawn a lot of attention in the last couple of years. And in food, there's a lot of platforms now. Obviously, all the contactless ordering platforms are doing exceptionally well. So in this last 12 months environment, we've seen a lot more, I guess, attention in this space, which is obviously a great thing for Kaddy and people really looking at the way they're doing things and looking at how to, bring down costs but grow their business and just streamline and leverage tech to do it.
Okay, well, without further delay, I'd like to, I guess, dive right into what Kaddy is all about. I'm sure the audience are sort of keen to hear about how it might help them in the beer distribution side of things. So, yeah, simply put, how does Kaddy all work?
Yeah, Kaddy is a wholesale platform that helps connect trade customers with beverages suppliers in Australia. So we're working with about 1,000 trade customers. We onboard those customers. So those customers come on board Kaddy, they sign up, very frictionless, very easy. So they can set up in 2 minutes. And then from that point, they can connect or they can discover, connect and trade with any supplier that's on the Kaddy platform. So old days, to set up a new customer account, you need to fill out a trading application form, have that signed off. There can be delays. And then that customer is having to do that with 10, 20, potentially 100 different suppliers. With Kaddy, we provide one platform to essentially facilitate that trade. So really streamlines the whole wholesale process from discovery through to payment.
Wow, okay. And how many suppliers have you got on board now?
So currently we're working with about 300 suppliers. Good chunk of those are in craft beer. So we've got amazing craft brewers on board. And from the get-go, we reached out to the craft brewing community and we're working with a number of breweries across the East Coast in particular initially. But since then, we've grown the supply base across Australia and, from bigger craft breweries through to some of the, upstarts. We've got a fantastic, mix of breweries, which is great for the customer.
I mean, you might have touched on it earlier in the piece, but what were the motivations behind starting and building, I guess, a wholesale platform like Kaddy for the beverage industry?
Yes, I guess from Mike, my co-founder, from his perspective, he saw an opportunity to streamline ordering from the customer perspective. With my supplier hat on, building and growing a wholesale business, there's so many challenges, and having a route to market is probably the first challenge. Being able to, you have a great conversation with a customer and they ask, okay, how do I order? And let's face it, the last 5 years, there's been so much direct to customer business. There's so many breweries that are running direct accounts. And I think that there's a lot of pros in doing that and you can obviously maintain the customer relationship, but also an opportunity to retain all those benefits of maintaining that direct relationship, but having a platform essentially support things like credit apps, invoicing, payment, etc. So with our platform, any brewery that comes onto the platform gets paid within 3 days, guaranteed. So it's really, really simple from their perspective. They've got that certainty, and it means that if you're growing a brand and you're growing your customers, then you can grow that. You can focus on doing what you love doing. Producing great product, building a great brand, managing customer relationships, rather than dealing with a whole bunch of sort of back office admin and chasing money and those kinds of things.
Yeah, and because like you were saying, what I'm finding in the podcast so far, that there's much more than just brewing beer. There's so much on the back end, and brewing is only a small little part of your time, And in the early days, people aren't going to be set up or have enough capital in their budget to have a sales team to deal with your distributors and go after those big pubs and clubs or bottle shops, whatever. So, yeah, this just seems like another way that it can mean that a brewery owner can spend more time in the brewery, coming up with new products, engaging with their local community. And one thing that was actually mentioned, I think it was in our small business and accounting segment, Jared Wilson from Craft Accounting mentioned about the whole distribution side, that nearly everyone in that space requires a director's guarantee when it comes to the credit apps. Is that something that still is in place within the Kaddy platform?
Yeah, it's a good question. So on the customer side, we try and reduce all barriers to trade. So part of that is that initial credit app process. So as a customer, as a venue, you can literally start trading instantly with a $10,000 credit limit. We don't take any directors' guarantees, etc. If customers are suddenly increasing their spend and do want to order a ton more each month, then there are certain things that we do to support that, but it's super frictionless. And that often gets in the way of trade. So, often credit apps can delay, business, and by the time a credit app is completed, the conversation, that momentum of the sales cycle is broken to some extent. So we try and just remove all barriers to trade along the whole sales cycle.
Yeah, and you know what? I think I might have been confusing myself there with some of Jared's comments around that. I think it was more on the supply side to the breweries, like so your malts, your hops, and all that. When he was talking about that, but
yeah, spot on. And I think it comes down to risk, I guess. Obviously, cash flow and risk and risk management. But brewers face that with their suppliers, just like customers face it with their suppliers as well.
Yeah, perfect. We've talked a little bit on this segment about the different models when it comes to distribution. So obviously there's the self-distribution, so where a brewery can opt to try do it themselves if they're only sort of super local and they can manage their own little keg fleet and got a couple of pubs and all that. They could probably do their own little self-distribution. And then there's the traditional model where, you talk to a local distributor, national, big major distributor. On your website, I think I saw that basically you combine both of these types of models. Is that right?
Yeah, you can think of it as a hybrid solution because the supplier in a Kaddy model, the supplier is still interacting with the customer. In fact, that's central to what we're doing is, providing that ecosystem where suppliers can engage, interact, communicate, with things like in-platform messaging. So that direct supplier to customer relationship is so important. Everything we're doing with Kaddy is built to support that. I mean, everything we're doing really is built on customer and supplier feedback. Whereas in a traditional wholesaler model, that's probably less of the case, particularly with the bigger wholesalers, the bigger national wholesalers. Obviously, they provide a number of benefits, but there's obviously a lot of gaps in those models, and increasingly so. They've only got so much warehouse space. There's a lot of venues that aren't dealing with them. And for suppliers that are producing, a lot of seasonal product, getting ranging in the wholesalers can be tricky, and it can often be a chicken and egg situation. You need track record to get product range, but you can't get track record if you don't have your stock in their sheds. So it's a bit of a tricky dynamic. But what we're trying to do is just bring the best of both worlds, and wholesalers, they do, they pay you for your stock generally, which is great on terms. And from our perspective, we take that, but we try and expedite that by paying suppliers upfront guaranteed, which means that they can essentially run a direct business, but have the benefits of the wholesaler model.
And I guess another question I had off the top of the head was, is this type of model, or is Kaddy geared towards particular size breweries, like, someone who's just started out 12 months, maybe only doing 200,000-300,000 litres a year? Is this something that they can sort of engage with Kaddy as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the Kaddy model, there's probably two buckets of value that we would say we provide to suppliers, to breweries. So the first one is what we call better order management, which is removing credit apps, streamline ordering into one platform, and also the guaranteed payment 3 days after delivery. The other side is, I guess, the marketplace angle. So that's being discovered by new customers, facilitate new connections, and a whole bunch of sales tools as well. So being able to manage, your freight, your minimum orders, deals, or volume pricing structures that you might have in place with your customers. So that's probably the second bucket. Each brewery that we work with, each supplier, actually across all categories that we work with, value different parts of those, I guess, two core offerings differently. Some suppliers love new customers, and that's all they care about. They just want new customers, and they come onto Kaddy as a new channel of distribution. Others value, the guaranteed cash up front, and that to them is the most important need in their business that they're looking at Kaddy for a solution for. So yeah, it's really interesting. I think which makes it a case by case basis. But I think for any brewery, we are trying to build solutions that do essentially address their pain points and help them alleviate some stress, whether it's finding new customers or being able to communicate with those customers, interact with those customers in a more streamlined fashion, or reaching new customers, or simply streamlining the orders that are actually coming through directly.
Yeah, I can see how that the payment guarantee within 3 days would be really, really appealing. It sounds like it's just making it safer for all parties in terms of the risk. They know who they're getting involved in, and because when I've heard some stories where, like I was saying earlier, the turnaround for getting payment by some of these big pubs who are big organisations can take quite a long time. So, and I know that Pat from Willie the Boat was talking about they shifted their entire strategy with their beer packaging from kegs to bottles. Obviously, a lot of breweries did when COVID hit our shores this time last year. But, he was saying even when COVID sort of slowly starting to go away, breweries are maybe starting to move away from that model, and your model might come in here and sort of provide that sort of new way of doing things. So, and like you said, you've got 300 something suppliers on there now. So it sounds like it's getting a bit of momentum, which is good to hear. But being in that, I know that you guys are more in that tech side of distribution, but are you able to share some, common mistakes that you might have heard probably in your days at Capital and Batlow as well in the cider game of, what are some of the common mistakes that breweries tend to do when they're dipping their toes in the wholesale distribution side of things?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, particularly having been in beverages the last sort of 10 or so years. The landscape has shifted quite materially. 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot of breweries or cideries, seltzers. I think seltzers are quite non-existent.
Gosh, that's been a theme and a half in this podcast so far, seltzers,
Yeah, so I think across the board, being a national supplier and being nationally distributed 10 years ago is probably easier because there was less competition. But obviously the last 10 years, the market, which is fantastic, has become more local. And that's great that local communities are, having breweries pop up and the locals are getting behind them. So I guess the market has become more local, and I think with that in mind, building a local following first is super important, and really engaging your local audience, and really looking after your local customers, doing in-store tastings and loving your local market, I think is super important. Whether some breweries are not doing that, I'd probably expect that most breweries are, but trying to grow, I guess, that distribution footprint too quickly, maybe with too many SKUs, can be challenging, because obviously craft beer is about freshness and losing control of your product, particularly in the early days. You like keeping control of your product consistency, and also getting that feedback loop with customers is super important. But these days, obviously, at the same time, with things like Gabs and the Hottest 100 around Australia, there is so much knowledge around, craft brewers doing good things, and there is that demand. So it's this sort of conundrum where you want to service that demand, but you're also mindful that you don't want to go into every single market, but also managing expectations and product. One of the things that you do see sometimes is some, suppliers having stock in many locations in, many states, and that can become problematic. Having control of your product and the consistency of your product and that customer experience as a result of having that great product is super important early on. And that's why starting local and building a local following and growing from that base is, a really great strategy.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll probably touch on it in some other parts of the segment, but yeah, I guess there is a minimum requirement or some minimum infrastructure aspects a brewery needs to sort of have a look, and it sounds like if you want to get in with the major distributors, you need to be set up, with a decent sales team. You need to have a dedicated sales force. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, you do hear sometimes, a supplier's one ranging in one of the big wholesalers, but that stock still needs to be pushed through, and it's still on the supplier, I guess, and that's why the direct model is often preferred, because you've got visibility over your sales, over your customer activity. You've got that feedback loop. sometimes with the big wholesalers, it's tricky to get that feedback and that visibility on your stock movements. And, you might get an email in 6 weeks' time saying, hey, this SKU, this line is slow or potentially going to be deleted. So having that control, I think, is really important. And that's why there is so much direct to customer business these days as well. Just having that control over your product and knowing where you stand and knowing how you're actually performing at a SKU by SKU level. So we're very mindful of that. Building, our platform is that feedback loop and that customer engagement piece is super important.
And one thing I guess I didn't mention early on is this platform really only available or currently to Australian breweries and Australian distributors, or is this sort of looking at going into other markets like Asia, China, or international markets?
Yeah, most of our suppliers are Australian suppliers. We do have some international brewers and other companies that have jumped on board. Brewdog came on board last year, which is fantastic. Yeah. Obviously, amazing brand. We have had interest from overseas. We've talked, obviously, the closest market is New Zealand, but up in Asia and also parts of Europe and the UK, these same challenges of a very fragmented wholesale landscape exist, and there hasn't been a player that's really kind of solved those problems with tech. The US is a bit trickier because of the 3-tier distribution model over there. It's all very state-based, and some states you can self-distribute, and there's all different sort of thresholds.
Yeah, perfect. So Richard, looking at your website before we sort of sat down today, I was having a look at sort of some of the services and benefits of Kaddy. You mentioned on there about how you guys help sales teams, brewery sales teams. Are you able to, I guess, talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. So there's a few things that we've done with the platform tech to really support sales teams, particularly at a region by region basis. So once you set up as a supplier on Kaddy, you can assign different reps to different customers. You can actually have those reps can have their own profile, have their own profile picture to really create that, I guess, that interpersonal relationship with the customer, which obviously is super important these days, particularly in hospitality, forming that relationship. The other thing, if venues, ordering managers or logistics contacts, if they leave the venue or if it changes, then it's updated on their end. So that way the sales team or salesperson is always communicating with the correct person, and that all communications are going to the correct person as well. The other thing, I guess, from a lead perspective as well, the connections flow through Kaddy. You can assign emails to when a new customer connects, then the supplier is notified of that, and you can essentially decide who gets notified of that connection request with the customer. And that's essentially just a warm lead, but often it is the sort of first step of a new supplier, customer relationship.
Okay. Now, it sounds like the new thing, and it sounds like you also might be making, maybe bad names, not a good way to put it, but you're probably rustling the feathers of the traditional distribution model with the launch of Kaddy, I'd imagine. Yeah,
we're just trying to, I guess, we're plugging a lot of gaps that they're not filling. They've definitely, obviously, that ALMs and RGs of the world, they've got a really important role in this industry, but there's just so much business that's happening outside of those wholesalers, and the way that they're doing things hasn't really changed in the last 10 years. So we think there's an opportunity to leverage tech to make wholesale simpler, reduce barriers, reduce friction, and try and help suppliers grow their business whilst not having to put 100 sales reps on the road, but really providing sales reps with the tools they need to run their wholesale business efficiently.
Yeah, it sounds like an easier transition for a brewery that's wanting to make that jump into distribution, because, we've talked about the brew pub model here, and I actually have aspirations to start out with a brew pub with some wholesale distribution aspirations, if it's received well, and after 12, 24 months, it's growing. Kaddy just sounds like a great model to sort of dip your toes in transition to and start getting some runs on the board in that distribution game. Is that what you're starting to sort of see with some of the smaller microbreweries in Australia?
Yes. I mean, some of the smaller breweries are dipping their toe in the water. Others are using it as their preferred route to market because it's simple. I guess every brewery is approaching it from a different, they have different objectives. Wholesale is at varying levels, is important to them in varying levels. Obviously, if you've got a tap room and you've only got a little bit of beer for wholesale, it's probably less of a priority than if you're gypsy brewing and you don't have a tap room, and then wholesale is obviously very important to you. So, yeah, I think every brewery is different. We'll approach it differently, but getting into working with distributors can be tricky early on in particular because you don't have that, those runs on the board. So therefore you go in that direct model, but whilst that's great in many respects, there's also a lot of challenges that we've talked about, chasing money and, credit apps and multiple channels of communication.
So on the Kaddy platform, suppliers being the brewery, how do they manage, their account on Kaddy for customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So once a supplier brewery is onboarded with our supply team, they will essentially have access and can set up access for multiple team members as well. And then it's self-service from there. So we will get the supplier onboarded, and then once they've got login details, they can change photos, edit descriptions, edit product quantities, stock on hand, etc. And then most suppliers are updating that information every week or two, depending on how much change there is in a particular SKU. But we're finding that most suppliers are sort of jumping in there every couple of weeks and keeping that information up to date. Okay, yeah, perfect. And leading into some of the industry insights, because I always like to get guests from all different walks of life in the brewing industry, and you being coming from that distribution arm, what sort of trends are you starting to see out there in beer distribution? Maybe talking about particular beer styles or, just in general. Yeah, totally. So we've seen obviously strong growth in a number of craft beers. From a style perspective, two key things have stuck out over the last couple of months. Hazy pales are doing really well. There's a number of suppliers that producing hazy pales. I think that's probably a trend set to increase throughout 2021 on the back of NEPA's doing so well and being so well loved. A more sort of sessionable, approachable style seems to be gaining traction. The other one is non-alc. So alcohol-free beers are doing exceptionally well, which is great. It's bringing other people into the beer market. There's a number of brands on Kaddy that, we're seeing strong growth from, doing exceptionally well. And, it's great to see that we can still enjoy a hoppy, interesting beer, but without the alcohol. And that's, these days it's really important to have that offering.
Yeah, well. It's a massive market. It's not the first time it's been discussed on the show so far that the low alcohol, no alcohol market is definitely worth exploring for breweries. But there is a little bit of extra investment from what I hear in terms of the equipment and the process. It's not your straightforward sort of brew. You tend to find some of the low alcohol ones losing a bit of the mouthfeel and body. So I guess what breweries are struggling to sort of find with their brewing is trying to make sure that they're getting rid of the alcohol, but replacing the mouthfeel that the alcohol normally brings to a beer. So, so as everyone can see, I'm learning a lot on this podcast. And hazies as well. We've spoken a lot about that as well. I think you might have mentioned on some of your suppliers, seltzers as well seem to be a big push over here. Is White Claw at all involved with you guys?
We don't have White Claw on the platform. In fact, we don't have any line products on the platform, but we've got a lot of independent seltzer, a lot of Aussie seltzer that's doing exceptionally well. A number of new brands. I mean, most of them are pretty recent launches, but there's also a number of breweries producing seltzer as well, and they're doing exceptionally well. So that's a really interesting category, and I think we've only just completed the first summer of seltzer. But Aussie craft spirits as well, we're seeing more sales of those local craft brands versus some of the bigger players on the platform too, which is really cool. And obviously craft spirits is only going to get, as a category, is only going to get stronger. I think there's about 300 distillers, but that's growing, every week, and share of market is growing pretty rapidly too. Yeah.
And we've talked a little bit, I think Pete from Wayward mentioned some of the issues that has been going on in regards to the beer distribution, more particularly in pubs, like with tap real estate. Some of the big players in the market, having, obviously a lot more capital behind them, being able to give pubs grants and glycol systems in replace of having all their beers on tap. Are you able to share some comments on that, and I guess how that impacts sort of the craft beer scene in terms of beer distribution?
Without going too deep on the politics of tap contracts, I think there's a bigger issue, and that is the playing field isn't level. So for craft brewers, from the get-go, they just don't have access to the same customers that the big brewers have. There's 50,000 licensed venues in Australia, and good chance most of those have access to those big brewers, but smaller companies and independent companies generally don't have that same access. So it's not a level playing field. And that presents itself as well in things like tap contracts, where smaller brewers, they're not able to band together and take on the big guys. So they're very much at a disadvantage there. So finding those opportunities is really important. If there are tap contracts, where are the opportunities outside those tap contracts? How does a supplier know if a venue is contracted or not? Where are those free taps that a supplier can potentially get their product ranged on? But it's definitely a tricky thing in this industry. But hopefully venues that are supporting craft are being able to influence other venues that aren't supporting craft as much. And we see greater penetration of craft across the board. And looking at consumer preferences, obviously craft is growing through 20-25%. But it would be obviously fantastic if venues were more supportive when it came to the tap contracts. That does obviously blindside a lot of smaller producers from getting a shot.
Mm. Yeah, you are seeing, though, a lot more craft. Like, craft is definitely making a big bite in the overall beer market. I'm seeing it in all my local pubs and clubs. There's always at least one or two craft beer offerings on tap with your Tooheys New and Harm Super Dries and all that. But even your bottle shops, going into BWS, they seem to be a very big supporter of craft now. It's almost like going into a Bucket Boys or something and, being able to pick all your favourite breweries at some point. And I was in a Liquorland the other day. They're a little bit behind BWS, but they seem to be stocking, some of the bigger craft breweries like Colonial and a few others. But yeah, so it's interesting to see that there is definitely a growing trend towards more craft beers, pushing out some of the mainstream, what we've typically been conditioned into sort of drinking. But so it's exciting in that space. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on the future of craft in Australia. What would you say? A lot of people have said that we're not quite at the beginning, but there's a lot more room to grow for craft in Australia. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such an exciting phase for the craft beer industry in particular. Craft spirits, independent wine, but obviously fast growing and super interesting parts of the beverages market as well. But craft beer, it's the most exciting time. 5 years ago, who would have thought the beer industry would be where it is now? The style, the quality, the benchmarking quality now is just so high, which is great because it means it lifts everyone else, and consumers are getting a great experience.
Well, and sorry to interrupt you there, but the consumers are a lot more educated as well. Like you were saying earlier, it's that quality, the bar for quality has to be so much higher because you can't get away with what you used to 10 years ago.
100%. And you these days it's not uncanny to be able to find a local brewery that's within a 10-kilometre radius that is actually producing some of the best beers in the country. Like they're popping up everywhere. So it's really exciting. The penetration of craft is growing, which is obviously, continues to grow. It still feels like we don't have that same culture as, in the US, where you're at a football game or a mountain, and it's just super easy to get a local craft brewery, and not just one, but maybe 4 or 5 of their products. So it's going to be great when we're at that level and you go to a stadium or you go to an airport and, it's easy. I think we're in that transition point at the moment. It seems like it's getting to that point. In 5 years' time, the availability of craft should be far exceed where it currently is. And that's what we're really excited about. Level the playing field, provide that access to craft, whether it's, customers and their consumers or the suppliers themselves to have a route to market. I think the next 5 years is super exciting.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you there as well. And I guess COVID is on, it's always popping up in any conversation anyone has these days. How have you seen COVID impact beer distribution in Australia, or how has it affected you guys?
Yeah, COVID was interesting, obviously very challenging, but interesting that it, I guess, influenced venues to look at the way they were, maybe procuring some of their product, but also suppliers looking at other channels of distribution or looking at ways in which they were able to generate cash flow. And that, for us, that's one of our big value props to suppliers, is that cash flow. So obviously cash is king. There's been a lot of government support, which has been fantastic, but obviously cash is king when you're running a brewery, and growth can be, your biggest enemy because you're funding growth and you're so busy doing that you lose sight on actually getting the cash in the door. So I think it's been a bit of a turning point for a lot of, sectors, just looking at how they do things. And for us, obviously a very challenging environment for hospitality, but looking at ways to increase efficiency as a supplier to better, reach new customers efficiently. How do you generate more leads efficiently, and also leverage tech to communicate and simplify as well. So I think there's definitely are a lot more opportunities, I think, but COVID for us, whilst it was super challenging for a good 6 months, particularly on premise rather. There was some obviously pockets of positivity in off premise. And I think the whole route to market distribution strategy was of a supplier was probably reevaluated. Obviously direct to consumer became more important with so many venues closing, and looking at ways in which you can grow your customer base, generate cash flow, become more important.
Well, coming towards the end, Rich, just I guess before we sort of say our goodbyes, any closing thoughts and advice you'd like to give, maybe just on distribution, Kaddy, maybe where guys can, or where people can reach you guys or start having a conversation?
Closing thoughts, yeah, look, stay close to your customers and just love what you do.
Yeah, perfect.
And you can find us on the Kaddy website. Feel free to drop me an email, rich@kaddy.com.au. That's Kaddy with a K.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, Richard, for coming on the Build Me a Brewery podcast.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris, for having me. Loved it.
Thanks for listening to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. That was part 4 and the final episode of the beer distribution segment. Our next segment, we move into a broad topic, but all very relevant to each other and important also within a brewery's workplace and the greater industry, and that is human resources, people and culture, training and safety. As always, if you are liking the podcast so far and find the content useful, please give us a follow and rating on whatever platform you're listening on. Also, follow us on all our social media handles, as well as visiting our website, www.buildmeabrewery.com.au. And I will also mention to listeners that we now have a new Build Me a Brewery discussion group linked to our Facebook page. This is a group of keen listeners and like-minded people discussing their brewery build plans and providing advice to others on the subject. Link to this group will be in the episode show notes. I'm Chris Hayton, your host, and this is the Build Me a Brewery podcast.